All right, this will be a video about Pat Tillman's death, and most people probably know the basics of this story. He was an NFL player who gave up millions to serve in the War on Terror after 9/11, and then he died under mysterious circumstances in 2004. And this is a fairly recent mystery compared to some of the other videos that I do. I remember this happening. I just never realized how crazy this story was. It is a massive mystery, just full of contradictory stories and cover-ups, whole bunch of wild stuff. So we'll get into all that. But before I get into the Tillman story, wanted to talk a bit about one of the craziest things with the Vietnam War. And this is something that's very relevant to the story of Pat Tillman's death. And that is fragging, which is something that was very common during the Vietnam War. And what fragging was it was US soldiers setting up grenades and rigging bombs during the war that were intended to harm or even murder their fellow US soldiers. So these grenades were intended to kill not the enemy, but their fellow US soldiers and commanding officers. And it was called fragging because these soldiers typically used fragmentation grenades to commit these killings. And the motives of the soldiers who performed these fragging attacks varied. Some became just really opposed to the war while they were serving, and they were hoping to basically sabotage the US war efforts by killing off US soldiers. There were other fragging incidents that were done by soldiers who were being ordered by commanding officers to carry out missions they didn't want to do, so they hoped that by killing their commanding officer, that would be a way to get out of the mission. And there were others who just hated or were mistreated by their commanding officers or fellow soldiers, so they fragged them in retaliation. Or sometimes fragging was done to remove problem child, quote unquote, soldiers who were maybe causing trouble or disharmony in their unit. So it is just wild that this was a thing, and what's really shocking is how common this was. It's estimated that almost 700 US Army officers were killed in Vietnam by their fellow soldiers in fragging attacks. And it's also alleged that the actual number of fragging cases in the war was much higher. And it was even said that soldiers would pool their money together for bounties that they placed on commanding officers, and whoever fragged the officer would collect the bounty. So I just wanted to mention this because the whole idea of a soldier killing one of his own comrades, it might sound like hard to believe or far out there, but it's really not an uncommon thing. And it's even claimed that incidents like this were common back in other wars too, but it just wasn't documented. And this is very relevant to the Tillman story because the main controversy of Pat Tillman's death isn't really who killed him. Even the official story says that he was killed by US soldiers, he was killed by friendly fire. The controversy with the Pat Tillman death is, was it a mistake, or was he killed on purpose by the U.S. Army? So with that, we'll get into the death of Pat Tillman, and as I mentioned, he was an NFL player who in 2002 turned down a $3.6 million NFL contract to enlist in the Army to fight in the War on Terror, and right from the start, he was held up as like the poster child for the war. He was portrayed as this ultra-patriotic guy who sacrificed millions to fight for his country. The media hype around him was just wild. It's just blatantly obvious that the Army was trying to use this Tillman story to get people to support the war. And after training, Tillman was deployed to Iraq in March of 2003, and very coincidentally, his very first mission was one of the most publicized events of the War on Terror. And that was the rescue of Jessica Lynch, and this story is in-freaking-sane. The Jessica Lynch story changed a bunch of times over the course of a few months, but at the start, the official narrative that was reported by the media was that Jessica Lynch, who was 19 years old from Palestine, West Virginia, was a U.S. Army member in Iraq who was part of a vehicle convoy driving to Baghdad, but they took a wrong turn and ended up in enemy territory, and their convoy crashed and this huge gun battle broke out. 11 of the 32 soldiers in the convoy were killed, and these first reports stated that Jessica Lynch just basically turned into Rambo after her convoy was ambushed. She engaged in this huge gun battle with the enemy. She was shot. There was this quote here, she was fighting to the death. She did not want to be taken alive. And the official narrative continued, saying that she was badly injured in the gunfight, and she was eventually captured and taken to a hospital by Iraq soldiers where she was beaten and raped and tortured. And then a group of Army soldiers, of which Pat Tillman was a part, they performed this daring nighttime raid on the hospital and rescued her. So it was like this ultimate all-American story. It was referred to as Saving Private Lynch in the press. Just this incredible story of this pretty young, patriotic Army soldier fighting for her life and enduring all this horrible stuff, and then being saved in a daring raid by a bunch of brave soldiers. Just an amazing story, but it was pretty much a total lie. Because it turned out that she wasn't being raped or abused or held as a prisoner at the hospital. She was being cared for by doctors, and they were treating her very well. They were operating on her injuries. The hospital staff donated 2 pints of their own blood to save her, and there was even a nurse who sat at her bedside and sang to her as she was recuperating. She also hadn't been shot, as was reported. All of her injuries were sustained when her vehicle crashed. One of her doctors who treated her had this quote. He said, "There was no shooting, no bullet inside her body, no stab wound, only injuries from a road traffic accident. They want to distort the picture. I don't know why they think there is some benefit in saying she has a bullet injury." And the story of her fighting the enemy off like Rambo after the crash, that was false too. Her gun had jammed and she actually hadn't fired a single shot. And it even came out that one of the Iraq doctors treating her had already tried to return her back to the Americans. He loaded her into a vehicle and drove her to a group of American soldiers, but his vehicle was fired upon when he approached them, so he abandoned the plan of handing her over and brought her back to the hospital. So the whole story of her turning into Rambo and fighting off all these soldiers before her capture, that was fake. The story of her being held hostage at this hospital and being horribly abused, that was inaccurate. And even the story of Pat Tillman and the American soldiers storming the hospital to save her, that was pretty much fake too. It was described as this daring nighttime dramatic action-filled raid on the hospital, but the Americans actually didn't encounter any resistance or enemy soldiers. They just basically walked into the hospital and grabbed her and then left with no resistance. And later on, Jessica Lynch herself gave testimony to Congress saying that the story that was reported about her was inaccurate and extremely exaggerated. And it's interesting to note that this Jessica Lynch story happened on only the fourth day of the Iraq War. So the Iraq War had quite literally just begun. It really seems like this was just a pretty obvious, pure propaganda story to get people to support the war right at the start. So that was Pat Tillman's first mission in the war, and from there he served abroad for about a year, and he basically became just totally disillusioned with the war as he served. He kept a journal and talked about how opposed he was becoming to the war. He had this well-known journal entry where he said, "This war is so effing illegal." And there's plenty of other journal entries and testimony from people that he served with who talked of how he just became very strongly against the war and very critical of George Bush. And Noam Chomsky became one of Pat Tillman's favorite writers. He was a very vocal critic of the war, and Pat Tillman was even making plans to meet Noam Chomsky when he was back in the US. And there was talk he would return to the NFL and use his celebrity status to promote anti war efforts. And that would have basically been a disaster for the military if Pat Tillman, who was pretty much the poster boy for the war on terror, came back and started speaking out against the war. Again, going back to the Vietnam War, one of the main reasons that public support for the Vietnam War faded away was the influence of the group Vietnam Veterans Against the War. And this was an organization of soldiers who'd served in Vietnam, came home, and spoke out against the war and even marched against the war. So these weren't like random college students protesting the war. These were soldiers who literally fought in the war, and they were coming back and basically telling people to not support the war because there was just so much corruption and awful stuff going on in Vietnam. And that had a huge impact in turning people against the Vietnam War. So if Pat Tillman would have returned from the war and started speaking out, or even starting up an entire movement like Vietnam Veterans Against the War, he could have had the same effect as that group did and really could have had a huge impact on public opinion of the war. But then in April of 2004, when he was only months away from his tour of duty ending, Tillman was killed in Spira, Afghanistan. And the official story, the first official story at least, said that he got into a firefight with enemy forces and was struck fatally from 200 yards away. And there were just massive stories everywhere about his sacrifice and the tragedy of him dying in battle and everything like that. It is just incredible the amount of coverage and tributes there were. It was just everywhere. But just 5 weeks later, an investigative report about his death was released and a different story emerged. And this report claimed that he'd been killed by friendly fire. And this version of events stated that Pat Tillman was in a Humvee that broke down, and Tillman and a few others were told to continue on by foot while other people in their platoon stayed behind to fix the vehicle. And the group that stayed behind was ambushed by a hostile force and got in a gun battle, and Pat Tillman's group raced back to help them. And it was night, so the first platoon made a mistake and thought Pat Tillman's group was the enemy, and they fired upon them, and Pat Tillman was shot and killed. And this kind of became the story that's been held up as the official story over the years. This is the story you'll get if you read his Wikipedia page or you read most articles or books about his death. Everything just kind of repeats this friendly fire explanation for his death, that it was just an awful mistake. But there are a ton of questions about this official story, and Pat Tillman's mother and brothers were some of the most vocal critics of it. Right after this report came out that said it was actually friendly fire that killed him, and this was just a few weeks after Pat Tillman's death, his family launched an investigation into his death, and they were extremely outspoken about the fact that they thought a cover-up was going on. This article on screen here is a massive feature on their search for the truth, and his mother has this quote. She says, "There are so many murky details, it's tough to know what to believe." And his mother had this other quote too. She said, "The deception surrounding this case was an insult to the family, but more importantly, its primary purpose was to deceive an entire nation." And his brother actually appeared before Congress and testified about some of the things that didn't add up with the official story of Pat Tillman's death. I'll just play a video here real quick where he talks about this.
The soldier who shot Pat admitted in his sworn statement that just before he delivered the fatal burst from about 35 meters away, that he saw his target waving hands, but he decided to pull the trigger anyway. Such an act is not an accident. It's a clear violation of the rules of engagement. Writing up a field hospital report stating that Pat was, quote, transferred to intensive care unit for continued CPR after most of his head had been taken off by multiple 5.56 rounds is not misleading. Stating that a giant rectangle bruise covering his chest that sits exactly where the armor plate that protects you from bullets is being, quote, consistent with paddle marks is not misleading. These are deliberate and calculated lies. Writing a Silver Star Award before a single eyewitness account is taken is not a misstep. Falsifying soldier witness statements for a Silver Star is not a misstep. These are intentional falsehoods that meet the legal definition for fraud. Delivering false information at a nationally televised memorial service is not an error in judgment.
And there are a million things about Pat Tillman's death that don't really add up, but there are a few things in particular that people really question. And the first thing is the gunshot wounds that he suffered. He was shot 3 times in the forehead, and the wounds were only inches apart. And the official story says that he was killed by an M240 machine gun, and many have said that getting 3 bullet holes in the forehead, one right next to the other, was just too precise of an injury to have come from a machine gun. They say that his gunshot injuries were much more in line with a handgun that was fired at close range. And another reason many people question these gunshot injuries is because if you go by the official story, it says that the soldiers who shot him didn't realize that they were shooting at fellow American soldiers. But we're also told that the injuries that he suffered are from a gun that was fired from 10 yards away or even closer. And that seems pretty hard to believe that the soldiers firing wouldn't have recognized that they were shooting at fellow Americans if they were standing only 10 yards away, especially if he was screaming, "I'm Pat Tillman," and setting off smoke grenades to let them know they were shooting at friendlies. One of his Army Ranger friends even testified and said that he had serious doubt that other soldiers could have been 10 yards away from a group and not realized who they were shooting at. And then Dr. Craig Malek was the medical examiner who performed Pat Tillman's autopsy, and he initially refused to sign the official report after the autopsy because, in his words, quote, "The gunshot wounds to the forehead were atypical in nature, and the medical evidence did not match up with the scenario of his death as described." Another thing many people found very suspicious was that Pat Tillman's body armor, uniform, and journal were burned right after his death, supposedly because they were considered biohazardous. And this destroyed what would have been very valuable evidence in the investigation, and it was a breach of protocol to destroy this evidence before it had been examined. And that same medical examiner, Craig Malek, said that he was furious when he learned that the clothes and body armor had been burnt before he could examine them. He has this quote. He said, "We kept asking, where are the clothes?" And when he learned they'd been burnt, he said, we kept asking, "Why would you do that?" And then there's Michael Rupert. He was a longtime investigator who was known as the man the CIA feared. And he went really hard into investigating government corruption and a bunch of mysteries like 9/11 over the years. And he worked with Mary Tillman, Pat Tillman's mother, to examine over 2,000 pages from Pat Tillman's death investigation. And he claimed the report on Pat Tillman's death was the most crooked and doctored investigation he'd seen other than the Keene Commission report on 9/11. So the main question with the Tillman case is, well, what was being covered up? Was it just a case of the Army lying about the friendly fire incident at the start, then lying some more to cover up those lies, and it just kind of spiraled out of control? Or was it a case of them trying to conceal the fact that he was killed on purpose? It's definitely not hard to find a motive for killing him. As I mentioned, Pat Tillman became very anti war during his deployment, and there were rumors that he was going to come home and speak out against the war, which obviously would have been a disaster for the military. And the timing here is interesting too. He was killed just right before the 2004 election season, and one of George Bush's main talking points in the election was everything he'd done with the war on terror, which again, if Pat Tillman came home and spoke out against the war or spoke out against George Bush, that really could have potentially swayed the election. And then there's also speculation that Pat Tillman was possibly going to expose some secrets of the Afghanistan war, specifically the drug connection to the war, because Afghanistan for a long time has been the poppy capital of the world. There's studies that estimate that anywhere from 70 to 90% of the world's heroin comes from poppies grown in Afghanistan. All throughout the 80s and 90s, the farmers in Afghanistan, poppies were the only crop they could make money on. Growing beans or corn, they didn't make any money off of that stuff. So all of these farmers in Afghanistan grew poppies in their fields. But a very interesting note here is that in 2001, the Taliban declared that growing poppies was un-Islamic, and the Taliban worked with the United Nations to stop poppy cultivation in Afghan fields. And this program was called one of the world's most effective anti-drug programs. Poppy production in Afghanistan just took a total nosedive, dropping by 99% in many areas. And this all happened in early 2001, and then very coincidentally, the 9/11 attacks happened later that year, and the US invaded Afghanistan and took on the Taliban. And right after that, you can see in this graph, poppy production in Afghanistan once again skyrocketed. So it's always been speculated that one of the secret objectives of this Afghanistan war was to restore poppy production in Afghanistan because there were a lot of very powerful people involved in the drug trade who were losing a lot of money without Afghan poppies. And the fact that poppy cultivation played at least some part in the war, that's not really a secret. There's plenty of articles out there about it and plenty of photos like this one of US soldiers patrolling poppy fields in Afghanistan. And it's been speculated that Pat Tillman was going to blow the whistle on just how big this whole drug scene was behind the scenes in the Afghanistan war, and he was taken care of to prevent that. So there are a lot of unanswered questions and mysteries surrounding this Pat Tillman death. It is definitely one of the most confusing cases to look into because no one can even really agree on the basic facts of the case, like the bullets that he was hit with, or the gun that fired them, or the distance he was shot at. There are so many contradictory reports out there about just basic facts like that. It's claimed there's never even been evidence found that a gun battle broke out that night he was killed. No other American soldiers or vehicles were hit by enemy fire that night, so even that detail about the case is in question. And even this medical examiner, Craig Malik, the guy who performed the Pat Tillman autopsy and was pretty vocal about how he thought a cover up was going on, you even have to wonder if he can even be trusted because he later went on to become the chief medical examiner for Broward County in Florida. And Broward County is notorious for being possibly the most corrupt county in the nation. There are a ton of controversial things that have gone on there over the years. And Craig Malik was the medical examiner who performed the autopsies of the victims of the Parkland mass shooting in 2018. And that's an event that has a lot of mystery and unanswered questions surrounding it. So it's really tough to know what to believe and what not to believe with this case. But I'll end up the video here just by talking about a few random interesting things about the Tillman death. And the first one has to do with Mike Rupert. And he was the really hardcore investigator who was called the man the CIA feared. And he's the guy who Pat Tillman's mother was working with in her investigation into her son's death. And this Mike Rupert just had a ton of very extensive research into the Tillman death on his website. He was really going hard into it. And on April 13th, 2014, Mike Rupert died by committing suicide. Obviously, it's incredibly suspicious that he was going so hard into investigating the Pat Tillman death. He was working with Mary Tillman, and then he committed suicide right as they're investigating everything. Very, very suspicious, but there was also something else with his death that I found very suspicious as well. Because just a few days after his suicide, quote unquote, death in April of 2014, there were all of a sudden all these articles about this soldier named Stephen Elliott, who just kind of out of the blue started talking about how he might have been the one who shot Pat Tillman in the friendly fire incident. And this story just got covered everywhere. Again, he came out with this revelation just a few days after Mike Rupert committed suicide. And the whole Mike Rupert suicide just kind of came and went. It did not get any press coverage or any attention at all. It was totally overshadowed by this Stephen Elliott claiming that he might have been the one who accidentally shot Pat Tillman, which is pretty unfortunate because it really should have been a pretty big story that this major investigator who was working with Mary Tillman committed suicide. Definitely seems like Stephen Elliott admitting that he might have shot Pat Tillman, which again just kind of randomly happened over a decade after Pat Tillman was shot. Definitely seems like this admission of his was timed to distract people from the Mike Rupert suicide, because Mike Rupert most definitely did not believe the official friendly fire explanation of the Pat Tillman death. And if his suicide would have become a big story, it really could have drawn a lot of attention to his work and research into the Tillman case. Instead, everything out there about the Tillman case after Mike Rupert's suicide was focused on Stephen Elliott's admission, and the whole Mike Rupert suicide got totally ignored. So I definitely found the timing of all of this very suspicious. And then lastly, just wanted to talk about Pat Tillman's brother. So he actually had two brothers. Kevin is the one he served with in the Army. They both enlisted together. But the other younger brother, Richard, is pretty interesting. At Pat Tillman's funeral, Richard Tillman got some attention when he delivered a very direct eulogy. He addressed the crowd and he said, "Pat isn't with God. He's effing dead. He wasn't religious. So thank you for your thoughts, but he's effing dead." And then after that, Richard Tillman strangely became an actor for a while. He had some small parts in a few major releases and apparently tried to become a stand-up comic for a while. But the really interesting thing is that just recently, in early 2025, he was arrested for live streaming himself as he purposely crashed his car into a post office and tried to set the post office on fire with a bunch of explosives. And it was said that he suffered from severe mental problems. His brother Kevin has this quote here after the crash. He said he was live streaming what I'll call his altered self on social media when he crashed. So definitely a strange little recent development to this case, but this whole Pat Tillman death is a real mystery. I never realized how crazy it was. Like I said, it's really tough to research because there's just so much conflicting information out there about even just basic stuff like the bullet he was shot with and the gun that was used. But it's definitely quite the crazy story. And then I'll end up here by just giving a big shout out to the members here on YouTube and the supporters on Patreon. Thank you so very much for your support. Really means a lot. I truly appreciate it so much. So thanks again. I hope you enjoyed the video, and we'll see you soon with another one.